He is an old man, and he is holding a knife he was not asked to hold. The village is Modane, 17 miles northwest of Jerusalem, a cluster of stone houses on a low ridge in the Judean hills, the kind of place that never expected to matter. The year is 167 BC. A Seleucid officer has come up from the coast with soldiers and an altar, and the altar is the point. He has built it in the open ground at the center of the village, and on it the people of Modane are to do a thing that has never been asked of them before. They are to kill a pig, an animal their law calls unclean, an animal no Jew has ever laid on an altar. They are to burn it to a Greek god, and they are to do it themselves, with their own hands, in front of their own children, so that the doing of it cannot later be denied, so that every man in Modane will know that every other man has crossed the same line, and that there is no longer any clean ground to stand on. The officer knows the village has a leader. He is a priest named Mattathias, of the house of Jorib, a man old enough to remember a Judea that governed itself, old enough to have served at the altar in Jerusalem before it was defiled. The officer offers him the honor of going first. He offers him the king's friendship, silver, a place among the men the empire rewards, the whole machinery of advancement that had already bought so many of his countrymen. All Mattathias has to do is walk to the altar and lay down one animal, one act, and the old priest stands there, and the whole village waits to see what a man does when the price of his life is everything that made the life worth keeping. Then another Jew steps forward to do it for him, a neighbor, someone willing. And the old man moves faster than anyone his age should be able to move. He kills the man at the altar. He kills the king's officer. He tears the altar down to the stones, and he turns to the village with the blood still on him, and he says one thing: "Whoever is zealous for the law, whoever stands by the covenant, follow me." Then he is gone, up into the hills with his 5 sons, and whoever has the nerve to come. And the empire has on its hands the one thing it did not plan for. Not a riot, not a tax revolt. A war over the right to worship the God of Israel, fought by people who have decided that this God is worth dying for and worth killing for, and that there are worse things than the end of a life. There are a great many worse things. The empire is about to learn every one of them. To understand how it came to a knife in a village square, you have to go back, and you have to start with the man who built the altar's logic, a king who believed he was a god. His name was Antiochus, the 4th of that name to rule the Seleucid Empire, and he gave himself a title. Epiphanes, God manifest, God made visible, walking the earth in the body of a king. His own subjects, behind his back, changed one letter and called him something else. Epiphanes, the madman. He had come to the throne in 175 BC by way of a hostage's childhood in Rome and a brother's convenient death. And he ruled the largest of the fragments left when Alexander's empire broke apart. To understand him, you have to understand what Alexander had done a century and a half before. The Macedonian had conquered the known world and then died young, and his generals had carved the carcass of his empire among themselves. And the peace that included Syria, Mesopotamia, and eventually Judea fell to the line of Seleucus. These were Greek kings ruling a patchwork of older peoples, and they ruled by a single idea. The idea was that Greek was better. Greek language, Greek gods, Greek cities with their gymnasiums and their theaters and their naked athletes, Greek philosophy, the Greek way of carrying the body and ordering a town and naming a child. To become Greek was to rise. To remain what your fathers had been was to sink. The word for this was Hellenization, and across the old Near East it worked, because it usually does. People want to rise. In Jerusalem it worked too for a while. And this is the part the festival lights tend to leave out. The first people to bring Greek customs into the Holy City were not Seleucid soldiers. They were Jews. Wealthy, ambitious Jews of the priestly families who looked at the Greek world and wanted in. For the better part of 2 centuries before Antiochus, the Jews of Judea had been left mostly alone. After Alexander, the land had first fallen to the Ptolemies, the Greek kings of Egypt, and they had governed with a light hand, taxing the province and otherwise letting the temple run the country, and the law of Moses ordered daily life. Then, around 200 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus III, the father of the man who would build the altar at Modane, took Judea from Egypt, and at first he too confirmed the old arrangement. The Jews could live by the laws of their fathers. Jerusalem had survived the rise and fall of one empire after another by keeping its head down and keeping the law, and it had reason to believe it could survive the Greeks the same way. What broke that arrangement was not a Greek army. It was Greek money and Greek ambition working inside the priesthood itself. A man named Jason, brother of the sitting high priest, went to Antiochus and bought the office out from under his own brother with a bribe, and bought along with it a license to refound Jerusalem as a Greek city, a polis, with all the institutions that made a city Greek. He built a gymnasium at the foot of the Temple Mount, and the gymnasium was not merely a place to exercise. It was the engine of Greek identity, the place where a young man learned to be Greek in body and bearing. And the young men of the priestly class went there to train, and they trained in the Greek manner, which is to say naked, in full view. And some of them, ashamed now of the circumcision that marked them as Jews in front of their Greek admiring peers, submitted to a painful surgery to disguise it, to undo in their own flesh the sign Abraham had received as the seal of the covenant. The sources record this with horror, and the horror is the point. Men of the priestly line were paying surgeons to erase the mark of God from their bodies so that they would look acceptable at the gym. The high priesthood itself, the holiest office in Israel, had become a thing a man could buy, and then a thing a richer man could outbid him for. Jason was outbid by Menelaus, who was not even of the high priestly family, who promised Antiochus more silver than Jason, and then looted the temple's own treasures to cover what he had pledged, and who murdered a former high priest who tried to expose him. This is the soil the revolt grows in, and it is essential to see it clearly. The crisis was not simply Greeks against Jews, the foreign oppressor against the faithful native. It was a Judea tearing itself in half over what it meant to be a Jew at all. Whether the covenant was a treasure to die for or an embarrassment to be surgically removed. Whether a people could accept everything a dazzling civilization offered, its learning and its beauty and its path to power and wealth, and still remain the people God had set apart. The pull was real, and it was strong, and it came from within. The men who built the gymnasium were not invaders. They were Jerusalem's own elite, and they believed they were saving their people by modernizing them. The empire did not have to conquer the Jewish soul. A large part of the Jewish establishment was volunteering it. Then Antiochus went to war with Egypt, and the war went badly, and everything changed. In 168 BC, he had Egypt nearly in his hand, when a single Roman ambassador met him outside Alexandria and drew a circle in the sand around his feet and told him to decide, before he stepped out of that circle, whether he would withdraw or fight Rome. He withdrew. He went home a humiliated king, and a rumor reached him on the way that Jerusalem was in revolt, that Jason had attacked Menelaus, that his Judean province was fighting in the streets. He read it as rebellion. He was a man who had just been made small by Rome, and he was looking for somewhere to be large again. And he turned the full weight of an empire's fury onto a city that had only been fighting itself. His soldiers entered Jerusalem and killed for 3 days. The historical sources, the books we call 1st and 2nd Maccabees, written within living memory of the events and treated by historians as broadly reliable accounts, count the dead in the tens of thousands. He came into the temple itself. Into the holy place no foreigner was permitted to enter. And he took the golden altar and the lampstand and the vessels. And he walked out carrying the furniture of Israel's worship, the way Babylon had carried it 4 centuries before. But Babylon had only stolen. Antiochus had something else in mind. He decided to end the Jewish religion, not tax it, not regulate it, not insult it, end it. The decrees came down in 167 BC, and they were total. The daily sacrifice in the temple, the offering made every morning and every evening since the days of the Second Temple's founding. The steady rhythm that told a people God was present and the covenant was kept was to stop. The Sabbath was abolished. The festivals were abolished. Circumcision, the sign cut into Jewish flesh since Abraham, the mark that said this child belongs to the covenant, was made a capital crime. And the punishment fell not only on the child, but on the family. The sources record mothers who had their sons circumcised in defiance of the decree, being paraded through the city and thrown from the wall with their infants hung around their necks. Possession of the Torah was made a capital crime, and the scrolls that were found were torn up and burned. And the people found with them were burned beside them. Officers went from village to village with portable altars, exactly as one came to Modine, and compelled the inhabitants to sacrifice unclean animals and eat their flesh. And the eating was the test, because eating the meat was the one act of compliance that could not be faked and could not be undone. A man who ate had crossed over. That was the design. The empire did not merely want obedience. It wanted apostasy, performed in public, so that there would be nothing left of the old covenant to return to. And in the temple, on the great altar of burnt offering, the soldiers built a second altar, a Greek one, and there they sacrificed swine to Olympian Zeus, and they rededicated the house of the God of Israel to the chief god of the Greek pantheon. The writer of Daniel had a phrase for the thing that now stood in the holy place, the abomination that makes desolate, the Shikutz Shomem. It is one of the most haunting phrases in the Hebrew scriptures, and the people living through it understood exactly what it named. It named the moment the temple of the living God became a shrine to a foreign idol, with the smoke of an unclean animal rising where the daily offering used to rise. Remember that phrase? It does not stay in the 2nd century BC. A man will say it again, standing on the Mount of Olives, looking at a temple that has not yet fallen, and he will mean something that has not yet happened. What the decrees produced first was not an army. It was martyrs. The sources preserve the names and the deaths, and they are hard to read, and they are meant to be. There was an old scribe named Eleazar, 90 years old, a man who had spent his life teaching the law, and the soldiers tried to force pork into his mouth. And when he would not take it, the men in charge, who knew him and did not want to kill a respected old man, offered him a way out. He could bring his own meat, lawful meat, and only pretend to eat the king's portion, and they would record that he had complied, and he would live. He refused the mercy. He said that a man his age, at the end of a long life of teaching the young, would not now teach them by his own example that an old man will trade his soul for a few more days of it. He went to the rack, having chosen the harder death on purpose, so that the watching young would see how a man dies who believes there is a God to die toward. There was a mother, unnamed in the oldest account, who watched 7 sons brought before the king one after another and told to eat or die, and who watched each one refuse and be tortured to death in front of her, and who, the account says, encouraged each of them in turn in the language of their fathers, and was killed last of all. And there were the ones who fled to the caves in the wilderness to keep the Sabbath in secret, 1,000 of them, men and women and children. And the soldiers found them and waited, because the soldiers had understood something. They attacked on the Sabbath, and the people in the caves would not lift a hand to defend themselves, because to fight on the Sabbath was to break the very law they were hiding to keep. And so they died without resisting, every one of them, rather than profane the day. That massacre is the hinge of the whole war, and it turns on a terrible question. When Mattathias and his sons heard what had happened in the caves, they understood that piety of that kind, beautiful as it was a way for the covenant to die quietly and completely. A people that will not defend itself on the Sabbath can be exterminated on a calendar. So Mattathias made a ruling, the first ruling of the war, and it is one of the most consequential decisions in Jewish history. If we are attacked on the Sabbath, he said, we fight. We will not all die as our brothers died in the caves. The law was given that man might live by it, not die uselessly under it. It was a hard, clear-eyed choice, and it meant the revolt could survive. And then the old priest died in 166 BC, an old man who had set a fire he would not live to see contained. And he left the war to the third of his 5 sons, a man whose name would outlast every king he fought. Judas. They called him Maccabeus, the hammer. Understand what Judas was facing, because the arithmetic is the heart of the story. He commanded farmers. He had no cavalry to speak of, and no war elephants, and no siege train, and no treasury. And against him stood the professional army of a Hellenistic empire, the heirs of the men who had conquered the world under Alexander, equipped with everything the age could field. The Seleucid army was the phalanx perfected, ranks of men with 18-foot pikes locked shoulder to shoulder into a wall of iron points that no frontal charge could break, screened by armored cavalry and, when the king chose to spend them, by war elephants, animals the size of moving siege towers that could shatter a line of men by walking through it. Against that, Judas had men who had left their fields with whatever they could carry, who knew the hills the way the Greeks never would, and who believed, the way the soldiers across the valley did not, that the God of Israel was fighting on their side. By every measure that decides battles, the Maccabees should not have won a single one. The sources give numbers, and historians rightly note that the writers of the Maccabean books inflated the size of the armies they defeated, because a larger enemy makes a greater miracle, and a defeated phalanx of 50,000 is a better story than a defeated patrol of 500. But strip the numbers down to the most cautious reconstruction, and the shape of the thing remains astonishing. A few hundred, then a few thousand, lightly armed men from the hill villages, breaking column after column of imperial troops. Judas understood the one advantage he had, which was the ground, and he built his entire way of war on it. He would not meet the Seleucid columns in the open plain, where their discipline and their cavalry and their pikes would grind him to nothing in an hour. He fought where the land canceled their strengths. The phalanx is a wall, and a wall is only terrible on flat ground. Tilt the ground, break it with rocks and ravines, and the wall comes apart, and the man with the long pike on broken slope is worse off than the man with the short sword who grew up climbing it. The mountain road from the coast up to Jerusalem runs through a narrow ascent at a place called Beth-horon, a defile where a great army has to string itself out thin and long and cannot bring its numbers to bear. And there Judas fell on a Seleucid general named Seron from above, and broke him and sent the survivors running down onto the plain. At Emmaus, on the edge of that plain, he learned that the enemy commander had split his force and sent a column out by night to find the Maccabee camp and destroy it. in the dark. Judas did the unthinkable thing, the thing a cornered farmer's militia is not supposed to have the discipline or the nerve to do. He broke camp and marched his own men in the dark, around the hunting column, toward the main enemy camp the column had left behind, and struck it at dawn while it stood half empty, and burned it to the ground. The soldiers who had spent the night hunting an enemy that was no longer there came back in the morning to find smoke where their army had been. And they did not stop running until they were out of the hills. He fought the regent Lysias himself, the most powerful man in the empire, after the king, at Beth-zur on the southern road, and held him, and the road to Jerusalem lay open. And then, in the winter of 164 BC, 3 years almost to the day after the abomination was raised on the altar, Judas Maccabeus walked into Jerusalem and up onto the Temple Mount and into the holy place, and he found it as the soldiers had left it. The gates burned, the chambers thrown down, weeds growing in the courts where the smoke of the offering used to rise, growing up between the paving stones of the most sacred ground his people knew. As though the place had been not just defiled, but forgotten, left to the wind and the seed like a ruin in the desert. The pagan altar still standing over the altar of God. What he did next is the thing the festival remembers. He did not raise the defiled altar and cart it off, because the stones had touched the sacrilege and could not simply be reused. And they could not, in conscience, be destroyed either, because stones that had once been part of God's altar were not the empire's to throw away. So they took the defiled stones down carefully and stored them in a chamber on the Temple Mount, to wait there until a prophet should come who could say what was to be done with them. They built a new altar of unhewn stone, as the law of Moses required, stone no iron tool had shaped. They made new holy vessels to replace the ones Antiochus had carried off, a new lampstand, a new table, new incense altars of gold. They cleansed the courts, and on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, in 164 BC, they kindled the lamps and laid the first offering on the new altar, and gave the house of God back to the God of the house. The oldest account says the people fell on their faces. It says they celebrated for 8 days with gladness, and that Judas and his brothers decreed that these 8 days should be kept every year, from generation to generation, so that what had been done here would not be forgotten. That is the origin of the festival the Jewish world still keeps in the dark of winter. Hanukkah. The word means dedication. There is a story attached to it that almost everyone has heard, and honesty about the sources requires a word on it. The story is that when the Maccabees came to relight the great lampstand, they found only a single sealed jar of consecrated oil, enough for 1 day, and that it burned miraculously for 8 days until more could be made. And that this is why the festival lasts 8 days, and why its central act is the kindling of lights. It is a beautiful story. It is also a late one. The oldest sources, the books written within a generation of the events, say nothing about a jar of oil. They tell you the festival lasts 8 days, and they give a plainer reason, that the people had been unable to keep the autumn Feast of Tabernacles during the war, an 8-day feast. And so they kept it now, in winter, in the reclaimed temple, at last. The miracle of the oil appears in the rabbinic writings centuries later. For the people who actually fought the war, the miracle was not the oil. The miracle was the victory. The miracle was that a priest's family from a hill village had taken the house of God back from the empire that ruled the world, and that the daily offering, the one Antiochus had stopped, was burning again on the mountain where it belonged. Now the history has to do the harder thing, which is to tell you how it ended. Because the Festival of Lights does not. The war was not over, Antiochus died in the east the same year the temple was cleansed, raving, the sources say, broken in body, some of them claiming he died tormented by what he had done to the Jews, which may be the writers giving the tyrant the end they felt he deserved. The Seleucids came back. They came back with war elephants the next time at Beth-zur, and Judas's own brother Eleazar, seeing a great beast he took to be carrying the king, ran underneath it and drove his spear up into it, and was crushed when it fell on him. A death the sources record with grief and without disguising that the battle was lost. Judas Maccabeus himself fell a few years later, in 160 BC, at Eleazar, refusing to flee a battle he could not win, abandoned by all but a few hundred men, dying with a sword in his hand against an army he had no chance against, because he had decided long before that there were worse things than dying. His brothers carried the war on. His brother Simon at last won what the others had bled for, an independent Jewish state, the first in nearly 400 years, ruled by the house of Mattathias, the Hasmonean dynasty. And here, the history turns dark in a way the candles never show. The family that had taken up the sword to keep the covenant became kings. They took the high priesthood for themselves, though they were not of the high priestly line, and then they took the crown. And within a few generations, the descendants of the men who died rather than become Greek were living like Greek kings, fighting Greek-style civil wars among themselves, hiring foreign soldiers, murdering their own brothers and mothers for the throne. The grandsons of the Maccabees were so consumed by fighting each other that two rival Hasmonean claimants each appealed to a rising power in the west to settle the dispute. The power was Rome. The general was Pompey. And in 63 BC, Pompey marched into Jerusalem and into the temple, and walked into the Holy of Holies itself, the innermost room where only the high priest could go, and only once a year, and found it, to his reported confusion, empty. No idol, no image. And Judea, the country the Maccabees had freed, passed under the shadow of Rome and never came out from under it. The independence they had died for lasted about 80 years. The empire they made way for would still be there, occupying the same streets, when a child was born in a town a few miles from Modine in the reign of the first Roman emperor. So you could tell this story as a tragedy, a brief flare of freedom snuffed out, and you would not be wrong about the politics. But you would be missing the thing that actually happened, the thing that outlasted the dynasty and the kingdom and Rome itself. Something new entered the world in the caves of Judea, and it was this. Until the Maccabean persecution, people had died for many things. They had died for cities, for kings, for honor, for land, for the bodies of their families. Men fell by the thousand in the wars of the Greek kings, but they fell defending walls or pursuing plunder or obeying a commander. And the gods they served were the gods of whoever happened to be winning. The old scribe Eleazar and the mother and her sons and the 1,000 in the caves were among the first human beings in recorded history to die for a belief, not for a country which the empire was willing to let them keep, not for their lives, which the empire was actively offering to spare, for the refusal to worship a god they did not believe in. They were offered their lives at the price of a pinch of incense and a mouthful of meat, the smallest possible compromise, the kind of compromise a reasonable person talks himself into, and they chose death over it, because they had concluded that there was a God who saw, and a covenant that held, and a self that could not be surrendered even to save the body that carried it. Think about how strange that decision is by the logic of the ancient world. The whole machinery of the persecution was built on the assumption that a man will choose to live. Bend the body and the soul follows. Make the price of faith high enough and faith becomes a luxury no one can afford. It was a sound assumption. It had worked on nation after nation across the conquered East. Peoples who had quietly let their old gods be folded into the Greek ones and gone on with their lives. It broke on the rock of a faith that valued something above survival. And the people watching could see that it had broken. And that is the birth of religious martyrdom. Everything the word has meant since. Every man and woman who has since stood before power and said, "You may kill me, but you may not make me bow," descends from a decision made in the Judean hills in 167 BC. The Maccabees did not only win a temple back, they proved that a faith could be worth more than a life. And they proved it in public, with their bodies, in a way no argument could. And the world has never entirely forgotten it. And the temple they died to cleanse did not stay empty of meaning. Hold the two facts together, because Scripture holds them together on purpose. The Maccabees rededicated the temple, and 2 centuries later, in the Gospel of John, there is a single quiet line that almost no reader slows down for. It is winter. It is the feast of the dedication. It is Hanukkah, the festival of the Maccabees, the anniversary of the cleansing. And Jesus is walking in the temple, in the colonnade called Solomon's Porch, in the very courts that a priest's family had taken back from an empire so that the worship of the living God could continue in them. The people gather around him in that place, on that day of all days, and they ask him the question the whole festival was built around. How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly. And there, in the house the Maccabees had reclaimed, on the feast that remembered the reclaiming, he tells them who he is. The Maccabees had fought to keep the dwelling place of God among his people from being defiled and abolished. And now, the one who stood in that cleansed temple, on the festival of its cleansing, was himself the dwelling place of God among his people, the true and final temple, the place where heaven and earth meet, standing in the building that was only ever a sign pointing at him. The abomination of desolation had been the presence of a false god in the holy place. And here, on the day that wound was remembered, the true God stood in the holy place in the flesh, and they picked up stones to throw at him. Everything the Maccabees defended pointed forward to that moment. The daily offering they fought to restore was the shadow. The one standing in Solomon's porch on the Feast of Dedication was the substance. They gave their lives to keep a lamp burning in a stone building, and they were right to, because the building was holy, because it was the appointed sign. But the light the building pointed to had now walked into it on its own feet and said so out loud. And the people who kept the festival of the light did not recognize the light when it stood in front of them and called itself by name, Jesus. Here is the question for today. Picture yourself in Modane, the officer's offer in front of you. Your life and the king's friendship on one side and the altar on the other. What do you think you would do? The modern reader knows that 2 centuries later, Jesus will walk into that same temple on the festival of its rededication. The people of Modane knew none of it. They had only their faith. Let me know in the comments. The Maccabees fought a war against Hellenization with swords in the hills. But the deeper battle was never the one fought with weapons. It was the quieter war that had been going on inside Jerusalem for a generation before the first sword was drawn. The war over the gymnasium and the Greek name and the surgery to hide the covenant. The slow seduction of a civilization that offered a people everything the world calls good if they would only stop being themselves. That war did not end at Modane, and it was far more dangerous than any army because it did not kill the body. It changed the soul, and it did it with gifts. How Greek culture nearly accomplished what no Babylonian army and no Seleucid elephant ever could. The near erasure of the people of God by way of their own ambition is the next part of the story. That episode is called Hellenization, how Greek culture almost erased Judaism. If you want to follow this history as it unfolds, subscribe, and the next episode will find you.